This is a two-part lesson covering the requirements for question 7 on paper 2 of the new Edexcel 9-1 English language exams. Question 7 is a question which requires the comparison of two non-fiction texts, and it's split into two parts, part A and part B. So this two-part lesson consists of two separate videos. The first one deals with the general requirements for question 7 and then the specific requirements for part A of question 7, and then in a separate video I deal with the requirements for part B of question 7. So the lesson objectives for both parts of this two-part lesson are that by the end of the two videos you will know the kinds of responses required for questions 7A and 7B on paper 2, so for the two parts of question 7. You'll understand the differences in the focus of the two parts of question 7 and the difference in the requirements for those two parts of that question. And that will mean that you'll be able to provide effective and appropriate responses to part A and part B of question 7 on paper 2 of the new Edexcel 9-1 English language exams. Okay, let's begin by working out an understanding of the comparison question as a whole. So both of the non-fiction texts on paper 2 will always have a common theme. They'll have a shared theme. And question 7, which is the last question in the reading section in section A, will ask you to compare the presentation of that theme in two different ways, because question 7 is split into two parts, part A and part B. Part A is always going to ask you to compare just the similarities. You don't need to comment on anything that's different or contrast anything. You just need to look at what's the same in the way that the shared theme, event or idea is presented. In part B, you will always need to compare and contrast the similarities and the differences. It won't say similarities and differences in the question. What it will say is compare, and that word compare means to look at what's the same and what's the difference in the ways that the writers present that common theme in the two texts. In order to answer part A and part B effectively, there are a number of things you have to be able to do. So the first thing you have to be able to do is to synthesize information from different sources. So to look at different types of texts on the same subject, the same theme, and combine that information to come to your own interpretation of the way that that information is being presented and sort of the validity of that information. Now that is an important life skill outside of GCSE English. You know, in lots of jobs people will be asked to prepare reports or prepare bids for jobs, those kinds of things, and that will require research, looking at lots of different sources of information and taking what's important to create something new. So this is an important life skill way outside of GCSE. And also, if you think about the amount of information we're bombarded with today, it's important to be able to understand what's important and what's maybe less important. You need to be able to compare and evaluate the similarities and differences in two different texts. So you need to be able to see what's the same in terms of maybe the language devices, the structural devices, the ideas, the perspectives, the events, and evaluate the effectiveness of the presentation of that in terms of the particular devices of language and structure that the writers use. You need to comment on the effect. So going beyond just the identification of the similarities and differences, and comment on the effect of those similarities and differences in the use of specific language and structural devices to get the writer's ideas and perspectives across to the reader. And you need to be able to use supporting textual evidence that is relevant to the question and helps you to further your analysis and evaluation of these texts. Okay, let's go on now and look specifically at the requirements for question 7A. So we're going to be looking at what the examiners are looking for, what to include in your response, and the very particular way that the exam board would like you to structure and set out your response to question 7A. So 7A, the details of 7A then. as I've said previously, it's always going to ask you to compare just the similarities. So you are only looking for what is the same about the way that these writers, these two texts, are presenting a common theme, an idea, or an event. The focus of the question will be similarities of sight. So you might get the subject named in the question, you might get a key idea, a main event, or a key theme that appears in both of the texts. Okay, so it's always going to be one of the big things, an element of sight that you're going to be asked to look at. You are asked to compare what, so content, not how the element of sight is presented. So in question 7a, you are looking at the details, the content that is the same. You are not looking at specific language and structural devices, so they don't want comments and responses that identify similarities of language features. 7a is worth 6 marks. Okay, so it's relatively low scoring. It needs to be answered fairly quickly. To answer 7a, you need to take an overview and you need to look at the big things, the big content elements of sight. It tells you in the question to use supporting evidence from both texts, and it is important that you provide an example from each text for each thing that you identify as being similar. In terms of the 6 marks, there are 2 marks awarded for each relevant point supported by evidence from text 1 and text 2. Okay, so you're expected to provide 3 relevant points with supporting evidence from both texts. Your answer must stay within the space provided on the exam paper. You are provided with just under 1 side of A4 to write your response in, and that's deliberate. They're not looking for a long PED essay response to this question. They want something short and succinct and self-contained. So if you're writing too much and you're running over the line, you're not answering this question correctly. You have 6 minutes to do this question in. Okay, so remember, as with all these Edexcel questions, the rule is a mark a minute. It's worth 6 marks, so you have 6 minutes to answer the question. Right, what are the examiners looking for in terms of a response? What they're looking to see in your response is the identification of 3 general similarities of sight relevant to the focus of the question. So these are similarities of content, not of techniques. You need to present those 3 similarities as 3 separate paragraphs. You do not need to link your paragraphs. You do not need to write in PED. You need to provide 3 separate paragraphs. Each paragraph should begin by stating the general similarity and then providing supporting illustrative evidence from both texts. That evidence could be direct quotation, it could be paraphrasing of an idea or a theme, or it could be a reference to a particular event. Your responses need to be written in full sentences, and you need to use comparative vocabulary. So when you've given your evidence from text 1, you then need to say similarly in text 2 or likewise in text 2 in the same way the writer of text 2, whatever it might be. Okay, so 3 general similarities, 3 paragraphs, evidence from both texts, answer it quickly. Okay, so you're not writing a PED essay, you're just providing 3 separate self-contained paragraphs. So how do we respond to 7a then? Go back and quickly skim read both texts. Remember, by the time you get to question 7, you have already read and answered a number of questions on both of these texts. So you've skim read them and you've gone back and read them for meaning and highlighted and annotated them. So when you come to question 7, go back, skim read both texts and your annotations that you've made and focus on the similarities in the presentation of whatever aspect of sight has been specified in the question. Choose the 3 best similarities, the 3 that just jump out to you as you're skim reading. Then when you come to write your response, write them as 3 separate paragraphs. Each paragraph is about 1 similarity. okay? And you need to structure each paragraph as follows. Your first sentence needs to state the similarity, okay, using comparative language. So both of the texts, whatever it might be, all right? Then provide illustrative textual evidence from text 1, which can be a direct quote, paraphrasing or reference. Then use a comparative connective, so likewise, similarly, in the same way as, to introduce the textual evidence that you're going to provide from text 2. Okay, you do not need to provide a PED essay for question 7a, so you don't need to explain the effects of the quotes you give, and nor do you need to link your 3 paragraphs, you just need to present them. Right, let's look at an example of what a response to 7a looks like that scores full marks. So here is the response, and you can see just by glancing at it that the 3 paragraphs are all separate. Let's get into the details of this. So the first thing to notice is that the topic sentences of each paragraph start with the word both. That signals to the examiner that you are considering both of the texts. It then goes on to state the similarity of site. It uses the keyword of the question. So if you look, each of these paragraphs has got the word expedition, and if you look back at the question, you can see that what you're being asked to compare is the events that happen on the expedition. All right, so that appears in the topic sentence, and that's saying to the examiner that you've read and understood what you're being asked to compare in this question, and you're providing relevant responses. The similarity in each paragraph is a general one. So in paragraph 1, we've got the fact that both of the expeditions were well planned. In paragraph 2, we've got an event, something gets trapped, something happens. And then again in paragraph 3, the similarity is a general one of an idea, the sense that both explorers feel a sense of failure and frustration. Okay, so what we haven't got there are similarities of specific language and structural devices, such as emotive language or 3-part lists or complex sentences. We're dealing with general big aspects of site, so subject matter, ideas, themes and events. After we've stated the general similarity, we then start by providing some evidence from text 1. So we state text 1. You need to clearly indicate to the examiner which text you're writing about, and you can do that either by saying text 1, writing text 1 as I've done in the first 2 paragraphs, or by naming the writer of one of the texts, because then the examiner knows which one that you're referring to. You then provide your textual evidence. And you can see that in the first 2 paragraphs that textual evidence comes in the phrase in the form of references and paraphrasing, and in the final paragraph there is a short direct quotation embedded into the sentence itself. We then need a comparative connective to signal that we're moving on to text 2, so we've got similarly and likewise, and then in the middle paragraph we've got the word and that suggests that text 2 is doing the same thing. So that signals that the focus is shifting to the second text. Again, you need to refer directly to the text, either by naming it as text 2 or naming the writer, so that the examiner is clear that you're talking about the other text. And you then need to provide your evidence, which again can be either direct quotation, paraphrasing or referencing. Okay, so you can see the way that that is working in there, and the key things with this are that there is no explanation of the effect of the evidence provided. You're not writing PED paragraphs, this is testing skimming, scanning and information retrieval. It's not testing reading for meaning, it's not testing inferential thinking, so you don't need to explain the effect of any of the evidence that you provide. Things to note about this are that the paragraphs are not linked to one another in any way. However, the paragraphs are written in full sentences and continuous prose. It is not acceptable to simply provide a bullet point list response to this. The examiners do expect to see responses written in full sentences and in continuous prose. Okay, so it is a quick question to answer. It does need to be just retrieval of information and showing that you've understood the general similarities, but please do not write bullet point lists of quotes or use subheadings for each of the texts. Okay, so that's what a good response to 7A looks like in terms of how it's laid out and what's contained within each of the paragraphs. So let's just recap now the do's and don'ts for answering question 7A effectively. So in order to answer question 7A effectively, you need to identify 3 main similarities of sight. There will be lots of similarities. You need to identify the ones that jump out at you from the page when you go back and skim read that text. You then provide 1 paragraph about each similarity, so you end up with a total of 3 separate paragraphs. You begin each paragraph by stating the similarity in the topic sentence, and remember that similarity is a general one. It is not a similarity of technique, it's a similarity of content. You must then provide supporting textual evidence from both texts and signal to the examiner very clearly which text you are referring to. You must use comparative connectives to link your textual evidence so that the examiner knows that you're seeing what is the same about those texts. So words like similarly, likewise, in the same way are all good connectives to use in there. You need to keep your paragraphs separate, so there is no requirement to try and link them and try and make the topic sentences link back to the paragraph before. They are 3 self-contained paragraphs on separate similarities. And you also need to keep your response within the space provided on the paper. Okay, they don't want a long peed essay, they want something short, sharp and snappy. Okay, so in terms of what you shouldn't do not try and write about all the similarities between the texts. There will be lots of similarities because they have these shared themes between them. It is not possible to write about all of the similarities either in response to question 7A or 7B. Don't identify similarities of language and structural devices, that is technique. Remember to focus on content, on the big things. Do not write a peed essay. 7A is testing your skimming, your scanning and your information retrieval. They don't want you to analyse or evaluate or comment in any kind of way on the effect of any of those things. They just want you to provide them. Don't try to link the similarities. There doesn't have to be any connection between them. They can come from anywhere in the text. You don't need to try and make it coherent and cohesive in that kind of way. When you're giving your examples, your supporting textual evidence, avoid giving examples of specific language and structural devices. You won't get marks for that because that isn't what you're being asked to look at. Don't comment on the effect of specific devices. So again, we're not writing peed and we're not looking at technique, we're looking at content. Don't comment on any differences. Remember, 7A only wants you to provide examples of the things that are the same about these 2 texts, not the things that are different. And comment on the similarities of sight. Only comment on the ones that are relevant to the question that's set. There will, as I've said, there will be lots of similarities in here, and you need to be discriminating in your choices and make sure that the elements that you provide, the examples that you provide, are not only similarities of sight, but they are relevant to the aspect of sight that has been specified in the question. And don't write too much. Don't go over to the next page. And don't ask for extra paper. You need to keep it within the space that is provided on the exam paper. So they are the requirements for 7A. In the companion video to this one, I will go through the requirements for question 7B.